The hearing will come to order, and I want to welcome each and every one of you to this hearing on how forced labor in China taints America's seafood supply chain. The compass, as we all know, is an instrument of great assistance to navigators and seafarers. Its origins lie in ancient China, specifically in the Han Dynasty, which dates back to the 3rd century BC. It's one of the many enduring contributions China has made not only to maritime exploration, navigation, and safety, but also to world civilization. Yet today, we find ourselves confronting a very different reality in China, where its moral compass is adrift, both at sea and on the land. Recent revelations from a comprehensive 4-year investigation conducted by the Outlaw Ocean Project has shed light on deeply troubling practices within the Chinese distant water fishing fleet and seafood processing industry. These practices involve egregious violations of human rights, including forced labor and other exploitative activities. A 4-year investigation led brilliantly by Ian Urbina, who will testify to our commission today, found, for example, that, quote, almost half of the Chinese squid fleet, 357 of the 751 ships that they studied, were tied to human rights and environmental violations, and that over 100 Chinese squid ships engaged in illegal fishing, including trespassing into waters of other nations. On land, the investigation reveals a disconcerting pattern of PRC-based companies exploiting the forced labor of Uyghurs and North Koreans to process substantial quantities of seafood destined to the United States market. From fish sticks to calamari, these products infiltrate the supply chains of major restaurants, wholesalers, and even find their way into the meals served in American schools and military bases. Such actions directly contravene the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and the Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Acts, both of which strictly prohibit the importation of goods produced by forced labor into the United States market. It is evident that the People's Republic of China is not the sole party involved in these reprehensible practices. Governments, including our own, have been complicit, however unwittingly or wittingly, in the procurement of tainted seafood. Our panel of experts, and what a group of experts we have indeed before this commission today, will testify and emphasize the extent to which government procurement processes and policies have enabled these injustices. That is why Senator Merkley and I have drafted a letter to the Department of Homeland Security without objection. The letter to Mayorkas, to Secretary Mayorkas, will be made a part of the record, calling for a comprehensive investigation into not only the PRC's disturbing activities at sea and on the land, but also the weaknesses of our system and the complicity of the private sector in the seafood industry. Beyond these egregious abuses of human rights, there are also national security implications as well. Chinese fishing vessels serve as part of China's maritime militia. Earlier this year, such vessels, under the guise of fishing boats, severed cables on Matsu Island, an island off the coast of China, still under the control of Taiwan. Additionally, hundreds of Chinese fishing ships reportedly operate in waters belonging to the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia, serving as a civilian militia to escort Chinese oil and gas survey vessels and drilling rigs. More to the point, just last Sunday, a Chinese Coast Guard ship collided with a Philippine vessel en route to deliver supplies to an outpost that the Philippines maintains at Second Thomas Shoal, located approximately 100 nautical miles off its coast. China claims that this territory, far beyond its legitimate boundaries, despite the fact that the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague made a binding decision in 2016 under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea that this area lies within the Philippines' territorial waters. This underscores an important fact. China, under Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, is willing to upend rules of the global international order and act in a lawless, predatory manner both at sea and on land. It shows no respect for human rights. We see that in a myriad of areas in addition to this one today, and it does not respect labor rights. I would point out parenthetically that when China was under consideration and the United States was moving towards the WTO with China, I held 2 hearings on that, and voted against ascension into the WTO and argued that they would change the WTO and not the other way around. We were foolish, in my opinion, to think that somehow a rule-based organization like WTO would somehow mitigate their abuses. Instead, they exploit them, and they have not come under the banner of international law even a little bit. Thanks in large part, let me just say this, to the reporting of Ian and his team, and published in the New Yorker and elsewhere, the consciences of American businesses and government leaders are awakening. And certainly, we're trying to amplify that. We're trying to walk with you, Ian, and our other distinguished witnesses to try to make real and systemic reforms. Some are beginning to walk away from their abuse-tainted sourcing. This includes the supermarket chain Albertsons, as well as McDonald's Filet-O-Fish. Both have severed ties with the supplier implicated in Ian's reporting on forced labor practices. So there's already good things happening, but so much more needs to happen because of this landmark and historic human rights work. And we are seeing similar actions taken beyond the seafood industry. Over the summer, this commission, after a hearing on these issues of forced labor, the Wisconsin-based company, Milwaukee Tool, regarding allegations that the company had purchased gloves from a supplier that was utilizing forced prison labor to make those gloves. Milwaukee Tool took action to investigate its supply chain, and I and my distinguished staff met with them last week. They discovered multiple examples of counterfeit gloves originating in the PRC, bearing their brand name. Perhaps they were even made in a prison camp. Part of that lawless behavior I spoke of includes ubiquitous, unauthorized counterfeit goods. We know they proliferate all over China, and there needs to be far more done. It's not just the theft of intellectual property, it is the production of these counterfeit goods that flood our market, the European Union, and really the world market. The upshot is that the Milwaukee Tool has cut ties with the glove manufacturer in question, and they are now moving that operation outside of China altogether. I am deeply encouraged that the company has taken these positive steps, and it is yet another example of an American company responding constructively to reports of human rights abuses in the PRC. It is now as I think all of you know, this is not just a bicameral House-Senate, bipartisan, Democrat and Republican. It also includes the executive branch, and we are really privileged to have with us Thea Lee, who I've known for decades. When she worked for the AFL-CIO, she was just a one-woman force fighting against labor human rights abuses, and now she is the Deputy Undersecretary for ILABs, and I just want to thank her for her leadership and yield to her for any comments you might want to make.
Thank you so much, Chairman Smith. And good morning, everybody. It is a great pleasure to be here this morning with all of you, and I would like to thank you and your staff, Chairman Smith, for the courtesy extended to me to come and to speak early in order to accommodate my travel schedule later this morning. So this is my first hearing as a commissioner representing the executive branch, and I want to thank you for your leadership of the Commission in promoting human rights in China and for exposing the government's corrupt practices that fall way short of universally recognized human rights and international labor standards. I would also like to thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to your testimonies. I want to recognize the contributions made by the Commission staff for conducting research, producing reports, and organizing hearings such as today's. Exposing the abusive labor practices in fishing is of critical importance, as those abuses impact America's seafood supply chain, global supply chains, and community livelihoods around the world. This industry sits at the intersection of key Biden administration priorities: human and worker rights, environmental protection, food safety, and national security. It is clear that we are at a moment where further urgent action is needed to achieve a whole-of-government approach to address egregious abuse of worker rights in the seafood industry. In 2022, President Biden signed the historic National Security Memorandum on combating illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing and associated labor abuses. As shown in the recent annual report, the U.S. government has taken actions to sanction human rights abusers and provide tools that help protect fishers from exploitation. At the Bureau of International Labor Affairs, known as ILAB, an agency within the Department of Labor, our job is to advocate for worker rights around the world. We engage with our interagency and multilateral partners to fully leverage U.S. enforcement mechanisms and trade frameworks to prevent tainted seafood from reaching U.S. shores. We are pushing for better governance, including of crew labor rights on the high seas, and we are seeking to improve labor inspections on vessels and in seafood processing. I think folks know we publish and maintain a list of goods produced with child labor or forced labor based on our evidence-based research. We have documented child labor or forced labor in the production of fish, dried fish, shellfish, and shrimp in 20 countries, including China. Our Comply Chain and Better Trade tool apps serve as useful resources for workers' protection and the private sector's due diligence process. We have also dedicated more than $20 million in project funding to address labor exploitation in the fishing and seafood sectors globally. Our research and advocacy work has directly contributed to the U.S. government's ability to stop tainted seafood at the border. The sanctioning of Pingtang Marine Enterprise, a Chinese fishing conglomerate, for labor abuse and illegal unreported and unregulated fishing was a significant step in our enforcement actions. But we know that government action alone will not solve this problem. We need more reliable information, effective policy and enforcement actions, and transparency and accountability in global supply chains. We would like to see, as Chairman Smith said, the industry take greater responsibility for global supply chains. We need more effective tools to strengthen penalties and to deny market access to actors that tolerate labor exploitation. Chair Smith, while the challenges remain daunting, progress is possible. And I saw this clearly. I met with some Indonesian fishers and advocates earlier this year at the Seafood Expo North America, and they told me that some simple improvements in working conditions, such as having access to Wi-Fi, so that they have means of communication at sea, could help prevent exploitation. It could make an enormous difference in people's lives. And we have been working with the Taiwanese government and with others to see if we can move that forward, because it provides a chain of communication and it can help address especially some of the most egregious labor abuses in terms of unsafe conditions and forced labor. So I'm looking forward to hearing from the witnesses today on suggestions on how government, business, and consumers can help turn the tide on forced labor in fishing. The Department of Labor is deeply committed to building a more sustainable seafood sector that respects labor rights and promotes the welfare of all the workers on fishing vessels and in the processing chain. Again, let me thank the witnesses, the esteemed witnesses, for being here today. I'm looking forward to hearing your testimony. But I also want to thank you for the work that you all do every day to bring attention to these urgent issues. Thank you. I look forward to the rest of today's hearing.
Secretary Lee, thank you so very much. And again, this commission is really, really blessed to have you on it. We worked with you, again, when you were not within government, and to have such an advocate who is so knowledgeable is truly remarkable. So thank you so much. I'd like to now introduce our distinguished witnesses, beginning first with Mr. Ian Urbina, who is the director and founder of the Outlaw Ocean Project, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit journalism organization that produces investigative stories about human rights, environmental and labor concerns at sea. Mr. Urbina and his team of international investigative reporters conducted a remarkable, historic, landmark, 4-year investigation both on land and at sea, exposing horrific labor abuses in the global seafood industry, attributable to the Chinese Communist Party, and how this has tainted the United States seafood supply chain. I'd like to note that this reporting is truly groundbreaking. It's the first reporting of its kind, revealing how Uyghurs, North Koreans, and others are forced to work in seafood processing plants. His team is doing incredible work to shed light on the plights of persecuted communities and individuals trapped and held either on Chinese fishing vessels or in these plants thousands of miles away from their homes. Before founding the Outlaw Ocean Project, Mr. Urbina spent more than a decade as a staff reporter for the New York Times. He has received various journalism awards, including a Pulitzer Prize and an Emmy. Thank you for your important work and for joining us today. Our next distinguished witness is Professor Robert Stumberg, a professor of law at a place not too far from here, Georgetown University. He directs the university's Harrison Institute for Public Law, which often works with public officials and coalitions on health and food, trade policy, and human rights for workers. He's published several pieces, incisive pieces, including one titled Turning a Blind Eye, Respecting Human Rights in Government Purchasing. Professor, we look forward to learning more about U.S. government procurements and much, much more from you today, which will help guide us as we try to weigh in very strongly on this important issue. So thank you. Pardon me. We're also joined by long-term friend Greg Scarlatu, the Executive Director of the Committee for Human Rights. He testified before this commission on multiple occasions from as early as 2012, and before the Committee on Foreign Affairs as well, when I was the chair of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights and International Organizations. Mr. Scarlatu brings a wealth of knowledge on the plight of North Koreans, including extensive insights on North Korean forced labor in both China and in Russia. Many of us who have met him before are so impressed with his work, and that's why we couldn't wait to have him back here today to give us his counsel and insight. Finally, I'd like to welcome Sally Yozel, the Director of Environmental Security Program at the Stimson Center, where she leads a team that conducts research and develops global security strategies to combat illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, put an end to forced labor and human rights abuses in the seafood industry, and work to increase transparency throughout the seafood supply chain. With this, while this is her first time as a witness before this commission, and it won't be the last, she is not a stranger to Congress. As a matter of fact, she testified not too long ago for the House Natural Resources Committee to discuss full seafood traceability and how to stop Russian seafood or Putin's pollock from entering our borders. I fully agree with her views that American consumers do not and should not buy seafood caught illegally or linked to labor human rights abuses. And again, thank you for your landmark work as well. We are joined, of course, by our very distinguished co-chair, Senator Merkley, and yield to him such time as he may consume.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing, which builds on several hearings this commission has held on topics such as the implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the plight of North Korean refugees in China, the aggressive long arm of the Chinese government, and the importance of holding American corporations to account when they are complicit in human rights abuses. I'm going to suggest that I put the balance of my statement in the record, given the limited time that you have to be here and the desire to get right to the testimony. I'd rather we jump right in.
Thank you, Senator Merkley, co-chair. Mr. Urbina.
Thank you to Chairman Smith and Chairman Merkley, and thank you to the rest of the commission for inviting me to speak. I'll briefly talk about a 4-year investigation that my news organization, the Outlaw Ocean Project, conducted in collaboration with The New Yorker, focused on China's role in human rights and environmental concerns tied to the world's seafood supply chain. Seafood is a distinct global commodity. It is the world's last major source of wild protein. It is the largest globally traded food commodity by value. Seafood is also harder to track than many other products. It is typically harvested offshore, often on the high seas, where there's limited national jurisdiction and little enforcement of what few murky rules exist. Labor spot checks on ships at sea are rare. These workplaces stay in constant motion. Deckhands are often undocumented. They tend to come from poorer nations. Their access to political capital and legal recourse in the form, say, of lawyers, advocates, journalists, or unions is minimal. And between bait and plate, there are an inordinate number of handoffs of this product. It goes from fishing ship to refrigeration ship to port to processor to cold storage to exporter to U.S. importer to distributor or food service company, and then finally to restaurant, grocery store, or public food pantry, military base, or public school. These many handoffs make it tougher to trace the true origin of the catch and to ensure that there is no forced labor or other environmental crimes in the supply chain. Worse still, the few auditing entities that exist, what certification regimes that have emerged in the private sector, whether they focus on environmental or labor concerns, do a very poor job even at identifying and countering such crimes in these supply chains. China plays a unique role. It is the undisputed superpower of seafood because its distant water fishing fleet, which is to say those vessels in foreign or international waters, is vastly bigger than that of any other country. So too is China's processing capacity. Even seafood caught by U.S. flagged ships in our own waters is often shipped to China to be cleaned, cut, and packaged before being sent back to American consumers. China matters and was the focus of our investigation, not just because it is the global linchpin of seafood production, but also because China is the most opaque of settings, the most prone to illegal fishing practices, and, come to find out, the most dependent on forced labor when it comes to seafood. This forced labor occurs in two distinct realms, at sea and on land, on the fishing ships and in the processing plants. At sea, the problem of forced labor is endemic and varied. Debt bondage, human trafficking, beating of crew, criminal neglect in the form of beriberi, passport confiscation, wage withholding, denial of timely access to medical care, death from violence. We found a widespread pattern on Chinese ships. The investigation revealed that almost half of the Chinese fleet, 357 of 751 ships we studied, were tied to human rights or environmental violations. On land, the problem of forced labor is deep and consistent, especially after the start of the global pandemic led to severe labor, logistical, and supply chain problems in China. The government there began helping its massive seafood industry keep production and exports up and running. It did so by moving thousands of workers across the country from Xinjiang, a landlocked and subjugated region in the far west, to Shandong, a coastal eastern province in the far east, where much of the seafood infrastructure is based. Most of the global seafood industry is impacted. The investigation found that since 2018, more than 1,000 workers from Xinjiang have been forcibly relocated to at least 10 seafood processing plants in Shandong that supply dozens of major U.S. seafood brands as well as brands in at least 20 other countries. I need not tell this commission about China's labor transfer programs and the ways in which this state-run effort has been legally defined as state-sponsored forced labor, because the ethnic minorities pressed into service do not have an option to say no to these jobs. I also do not need to remind this commission that under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, there are very clear and strict prohibitions of any products in part or whole being imported to the U.S. that rely on Xinjiang labor. Lastly, I do not need to tell the people gathered here that if credible evidence is brought forward, as I think our investigation has, indicating the existence of Xinjiang labor in a particular supply chain, then this federal law, the UFLPA, puts the onus on industry, on the companies themselves to prove that they do not in fact have Uyghurs or other ethnic minorities Xinjiang labor tied to their products. And until they do, U.S. Customs and Border Protection are supposed to block shipments of this import. U.S. companies responding by simply saying that their partners in China at the plants have reassured them that no forced labor exists in their plants is probably not sufficient evidence that they are free from forced labor. Similarly, relying on social or marine auditing firms that inspected these plants but, by their own admission, were not actually looking for the presence of Xinjiang workers is also not sufficient evidence that they are free from forced labor. The Chinese seafood industry and government has already responded that using Xinjiang workers is not illegal under Chinese law and that the use of these workers does not constitute forced labor because they receive proper living conditions, a salary, vocational training, and fair treatment. But U.S. seafood companies need to understand that this misses the point. Under U.S. law, any use of Xinjiang workers is deemed illegal because it occurs in the context of a larger government-run and coercive program, and whether these workers are paid or they tell auditors or the state media that they are happy to have the job is not relevant. Think here for comparison of the use of child laborers in other countries, which may be legal or defined distinctly in those nations, but regardless of their laws, it is not legal for those products to come into the U.S. As an aside, I will mention that I'm intentionally refraining for the time being from discussing additional set of processing plants in China that our investigation found tied to U.S. seafood importers and that rely on another form of state-sponsored forced labor, namely North Korean workers. As you know, imports to the U.S. associated with this demographic of forced labor is also strictly prohibited by federal law. We will soon publish more findings about this topic. But for now, I will humbly encourage the public to take a deep look at the broken nature of labor auditing of the seafood industry and why seafood companies have been allowed for too long to operate in a place where they have culpable deniability, because to operate there, they have to agree to not look too hard at thorny issues like human rights. In fairness to the industry, the world was not previously aware of how much Xinjiang labor had tainted the global seafood supply chain. The world was also not aware of how pervasive forced labor on Chinese fishing ships existed as well. That moment has now passed. We now see that hundreds of seafood companies are tied to these Chinese ships and these Chinese factories. The question is, what will industry and government do about it? The laws on the matter, at least in the U.S., are pretty clear. The issue is whether they will be enforced. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Urbina, for that. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Stumberg.
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about 4 questions, if I can talk that fast. Number 1, which U.S. government agencies purchase seafood? Number 2, is the Buy American Act an effective antidote to purchasing seafood that is tainted by forced labor? Number 3, does the prohibition on purchasing goods made with forced labor and the U.S. Federal Acquisition Regulation, is it effective? And number 4, what's on the to-do list for fixing any gaps in these other laws? I've given you a relatively technical to-do list, which we certainly will not cover in today's conversation, but I'm happy to respond to any questions you might have about it, either right now or later on in today's conversation. Which agencies? It's a relatively small world in the context of seafood. U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Defense Department far surpass the other agencies that purchase seafood, including the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the Department of Justice, Veterans Administration, and others. Ian's team identified about $200 million over a 5-year period, which is certainly a conservative estimate, but that's a very solid baseline number, which could easily be double or triple or quadruple of that if only better data were available. It's interesting when you look at who these agencies buy from. USDA, Agriculture, buys from companies that are themselves importers, and 3 companies stand out. Almost all the purchasing for commodity programs is from 3 importers. Defense, on the other hand, buys from companies that are the 2 largest food service distributors in the United States, U.S. Foods and Cisco. They, in turn, buy from the importers. But what makes that interesting is 2 facts. Fact 1, these 2 largest distribution companies are enormous. Cisco, for example, has $68 billion in annual revenues. Compare that to a couple $1 million in federal contracting. It's just a blip on the scale of their revenue scheme. But there's an opportunity by focusing on procurement. That tiny percentage is a tail that might wag the dog, because the same company is also obligated to comply with the Tariff Act and its broad prohibition on any imports tainted by forced labor. So you see the connection between the Federal Acquisition Regulation and government purchasing on the one hand, and the Tariff Act, which is the foundation for the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So when Ian's team asked USDA to comment on his reporting, he got a very interesting answer, which was, A, we're obligated to buy American only, both U.S. caught fish and U.S. processed fish, in terms of our purchasing, and B, it's audited by NOAA, and they said they do on-site audits. So let me just briefly talk about that, and I'll probably run out of time before we get into the technical details. The Federal Acquisition Regulation has 3 exceptions to Buy American. One of them is if the supply isn't available. The second is if the domestic prices are unreasonable, with a litmus test of 20% compared to foreign prices. And the third is goods that are intended for resale, i.e., not for public feeding programs like the National School Lunch Program, but rather for resale in a military commissary or a government cafeteria. So there's 3 exceptions, and you have to ask them the question, if the USDA's answer is that we're audited for all of our domestic processing, if they've already opted out of the Buy American Act, there's no foreign source to be audited. So they presented kind of a catch-22 on their own answer to the question that Ian proposed. And so it's not that they're wrong. I presume that most of their purchasing probably does comply with the Buy American Act, and yet is there enough of a loophole here, legally authorized under the Federal Acquisition Regulation, for them to buy based on these exceptions? Let's think about auditing for a second. They say they do on-site auditing, but what's the site? Audits are often typically based in companies' corporate headquarters. They say they do on-site audit for processing, but again, the headquarters of an audit of a processing company may be different from the actual facility of the company. And so it raises as many questions as it answers in terms of whether the answer that Ian got is actually a clear explanation of the way they do business. And then, of course, there's a possibility that they do perfectly comply with Buy American. These are big companies. And so they could make sure that they are segregating their sources for U.S. government contracts, while on the other hand, for all of their other customers, practically every major grocery chain in the United States and most institutional purchasers, governments, universities, that huge market, it's those guys whom they are sourcing in Chinese processing facilities that used forced labor. So that's possible too, but then it reveals the need for a more comprehensive strategy for transparency, which simply does not exist. So I'm pretty much at the end of my time. That's the big picture. What's on the to-do list? I'll give you the broad categories. And we can talk about details if you're interested, either today or later. Number 1, plug the gaps in the Federal Acquisition Regulation. The exceptions that I told you about
With new law or through any kind of administrative action, or both?
could be either. Okay. So every piece of the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, can be traced back to an act of Congress. If you try to amend the FAR, you have to go through an elaborate rulemaking process under a council that's chaired by the Office of Management and Budget, which is where progressive regulations go to get sick and die. On the other hand, Congress isn't exactly a model of democratic efficiencies these days either, but everything can be traced back to laws such as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is the law that contains the prohibition on importing goods made with forced labor, and the UFPLA, which is not synced with procurement at all. So the opportunity to sync the UFPLA, which is run by Border Control Agency, and procurement is an enormous opportunity, and there's no connection whatsoever at this point. And I should just say in passing that it's common for government agencies of this scale, particularly when dealing with new laws like the UFPLA, compared to old laws that are underlying the procurement rules, not to be connected to each other. I mean, 9/11 was the story of agencies not connecting to each other. So we all have learned a very painful lesson that agencies tend not to. The U.S. government does not have a strategy for monitoring or policing its procurement government-wide. The UFPLA contains the DNA, if I may say, for a government-wide strategy that's narrowly focused on Xinjiang-sourced goods. There are interesting concepts and inventions in the UFPLA and in CPB's implementation of it. You could take that DNA and extract it and plug it into the procurement system, and you would end up with something that looks like a SWAT team of lawyers, auditors, and guys that like to wear sweatsuits and jump on boats and chase around the ocean and do real investigative and work on behalf of the American people. That could be a model for how that works. The United States government doesn't have it, and only some smaller progressive governments around the world do. Swedish counties, for example, have pooled their resources for that kind of SWAT team to support all of their counties, which do most of the purchasing for governments in that country. Another example is that there are about 900 universities and government entities in Europe that have pooled their resources for electronics purchasing, which are also subject to forced labor, much of it from China. So for that industry, they pool their resources through a monitoring entity called Electronics Watch. Electronics Watch, in turn, is based on the model of the Worker Rights Consortium. So there are models out there that the U.S. government could learn from, could incorporate into a strategy. There is no strategy. There should be. What better place to start with seafood as a test case to build that strategy around and then expand it to other sectors?
Thank you so much. I'm going to have to leave for a few moments. We have a vote going on the speakers talking about dysfunction. Speakers race, so I will go vote and then come right back. But obviously, you're in great hands with Co-Chair Berkeley.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony, and we'll just proceed.
Chairman Smith and Chairman Markley, thank you for inviting me to testify this morning. Deputy Undersecretary Lee, it's an honor to meet you this morning. The official dispatch of North Korean workers to China's seafood processing plants is a breach of applicable UN Security Council sanctions, international human rights instruments, and most importantly, our own CATA. Mindful of CATA provisions relating to sanctions for forced labor and slavery overseas of North Koreans, my organization, HRNK, has conducted a preliminary investigation into whether the working conditions these workers face are subject to Section 302B of the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act of 2016. We further endeavor to identify Chinese entities that employ North Korean laborers with the aim of determining if such entities and individuals in charge meet the criteria under Section 111 of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Until their repatriation began on August 23rd or the 29th, there were thousands of North Korean workers officially dispatched to Chinese seafood processing factories. In many cases, these workers processed seafood imported from North Korea. The importation of seafood processed by North Korean workers in China, seafood exported from North Korea to China, or a combination of both into the United States would constitute a blatant violation of CATA. 3 major seafood processing companies have historically employed North Korean labor and have exported their products to the United States. Witnesses mentioned the presence of at least 3 seafood processing factories that employ North Korean workers in Donggang, Dandong City. North Korean seafood exported to China from Najin Port is primarily transported overland by vehicles through Chinese customs. It is then distributed and sold in China's Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture, Liaoning Province, or flown into inland cities, including Beijing. Seafood processed in Huncheon is exported as frozen or dried food to the United States, Europe, Japan, and other countries. The main North Korean seafood products transported inland in this manner include various species of squid, croaker, snow crab, hair crab, and blue crab. North Korean workers process fish caught seasonally, such as cod and pollock, as well as clams during clam season. They also process octopus and shellfish packaged as Chinese export products. There are reported instances of processed seafood marked Made in China being shipped out to Vladivostok, where labels are switched to Made in Russia and exported to third countries. The employment of North Korean workers in Chinese seafood processing plants and labor standards violations may contravene to the ILO's Forced Labor Convention No. 29 and the Abolition of Forced Labor Convention No. 105, other ILO conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking Persons, also known as the Palermo Protocol. The North Korean seafood processing workers face inhumane working conditions, long working hours, denial of proper rest and breaks, harsh treatment, and minimal safety measures, posing a risk to their physical and mental well-being. Lack of freedom and communication, they're often isolated, facing limited contact with the outside world and their families. They're unable to exercise their right to freedom of movement and communication. Absence of labor rights, such rights, including the right to unionize and engage in collective bargaining, are inexistent. North Korean workers covet overseas positions, as the average monthly remittance of $70 is dramatically higher than the $3 average monthly industrial wage in North Korea. The average bribe paid to be dispatched workers is $2,000 to $3,000. The workers must borrow the funds from moneylenders and pay it back with interest. The workers are lured with false promises and subsequently entrapped under abysmal working conditions. Wage violations through compulsory contributions extracted by the North Korean authorities, unpaid overtime, precarious safety, and health conditions are widespread. The workers must moonlight for other companies to pay back their loans with the approval of 3 site supervisors, party security agency technical manager, who must also be bribed. Including moonlighting, a North Korean seafood processing worker in China may make up to about $210 a month. The North Korean workers' monthly wages are paid upon their repatriation in North Korean currency at the official exchange rate. During the COVID-19 quarantine, the workers received no wages, and the interest on loans increased, reportedly leading to about 30 suicides, most of them women. The Chinese companies pay the North Korean regime mostly based on production volume. The payment is made in Chinese currency. Men mainly carry frozen fish blocks, and women sit down and peel fish or squid or sort clams and crabs by size. Most of the North Koreans work the whole day in cold storage. Additionally, the pungent smell inside is unbearable. North Korean workers at the Chinese seafood processing plants usually work about 10 hours a day. If production targets are not met, the workday can extend to over 12 hours. The witness respectfully recommends the following: continue to encourage civil society groups with relevant networks to continue investigating conditions of work at Chinese seafood processing factories and whether products processed by North Koreans may end up on the U.S. market. Propose that new findings on violations affecting North Koreans at such factories be included in the annual report on trafficking in persons required under Section 110B of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Seek to determine whether the government of China has made any serious and sustained efforts to eliminate severe forms of trafficking in persons as they relate to the official dispatching of North Korean workers to Chinese seafood processing plants. And finally, seek to confirm whether seafood exported from China to the United States contains North Korean seafood products and whether North Korean workers officially dispatched to China process seafood exported from China to the United States. If confirmed, for example, if confirmed based on newly available information and analysis, for example, such products would have to be denied entry at any of the U.S. ports pursuant, for example, to a prohibition under Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for bringing this perspective to bear on the North Korean element of forced labor. And now we'll turn to Sally Ozell.
Good morning, Chairman Merkley and Undersecretary Lee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I ask unanimous consent that I include my full testimony into the record.
Without objection.
I was asked to speak about IUU fishing, or illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and the seafood supply chain. IUU fishing can take many forms and has been linked to criminal and illicit activities such as smuggling of guns, drugs, and wildlife, human trafficking and forced labor, as we've heard, as well as money laundering and tax fraud. In all of its forms, IUU fishing directly contributes to overfishing, threatening the sustainability of fish stocks and damaging marine ecosystems. IUU fishing harms the economic, food, and environmental security of coastal communities, particularly in developing countries, and can destabilize the security of maritime states by fueling corruption and distorting markets. I saw these impacts recently firsthand on a trip to the Gulf of Guinea, where Chinese-owned operations have expanded their industrial fleets, fish meal operations, and fish bases. These developing nations often lack the financial and technical capacity to manage their fisheries, and they often lack the political will, which can be influenced by Chinese investment. This can lead to food insecurity and unemployment, environmental degradation, and civil unrest. IUU fishing counts for a third of global fish harvests, and it is valued at more than $30 billion annually. Ultimately, it occurs because it remains profitable. Loopholes persist, and the opaqueness of the global seafood supply chain have made it largely invisible to governments, businesses, and consumers. That is, until last week, when Mr. Urbina's reporting has blown the lid off one of the most traded food commodities in the world, revealing a very dark side that has flourished undetected. Seafood accounts for more than $140 billion in trade each year. The demand for seafood is greater than ever. The United States is the second largest seafood importer behind China, and last year we imported 340,000 metric tons of seafood valued at over $30 billion. We know one simple truth. U.S. consumers and consumers around the world do not want to eat seafood that is caught illegally or that is the product of forced labor and human rights abuses. But how do they know? The United States imports about 85% of all its seafood. Just under 40% of U.S. seafood imports are initially caught in U.S. waters, exported for processing in Asia and China, and then re-imported into the United States. An illustrative example of this is pollock and salmon. Because of the war on Ukraine, Russian-caught seafood is currently banned from the United States, yet Russian pollock and salmon enter U.S. commerce every single day. Under the U.S. Cool Act, fish that is processed in China becomes a product of China, essentially hiding its real origin. So Russian catch can be processed alongside U.S. harvested fish, where it is commingled and processed into fish blocks, fish sticks, canned salmon, or frozen fillets, and then sent back to grocery stores, restaurants, and even our own school lunch programs, and onto unwitting American consumers. Stopping the importation of Putin's pollock through China is an easy fix if the United government implemented a more comprehensive traceability system that tracks seafood throughout the supply chain. As a former co-chair of the task force which created NOAA's Seafood Import Monitoring Program, called SIMP, I can say with certainty that SIMP was originally visioned to prevent and deter IUU fish from entering the United States. It was to effectively and efficiently track all imported seafood from the point of harvest to its initial entry into the U.S. market, or as we like to say, bait to gate. SIMP has been in operation for 6 years. Yet it only covers about 45% of the U.S. seafood imports. But it does not cover several high-risk species, including pollock, salmon, blue swimming crab, squid, and haddock. As NOAA Fisheries looks to improve its program, they must consider the fact that SIMP is currently a single, narrow program rather than a true traceability system. It is siloed from other relevant monitoring programs and hamstrung by its reliance on a paper-based framework. This opens the door to falsification and prevents the use of advanced risk analytics. Globally, the United States, Japan, and the European Union all have traceability programs, and when you combine all three, they make up more than 60% of the international seafood market. This is a powerful block. Several additional programs are coming online, such as South Korea and Australia. And all of these countries are looking to the United States as its global leader. At home, numerous agencies are working to combat IUU fishing. NOAA Fisheries manages the SIMP program, as I noted. The U.S. The U.S. Coast Guard uses satellite AIS and radar to track its fishing vessels at sea. The Department of Labor monitors for forced labor and human rights abuses. The Food and Drug Administration collects seafood data relating to human health and food safety. And the Treasury Department follows the money, which can provide valuable insights into beneficial ownership of IUU fishing enterprises, and I could go on. But despite all of this data and all of these programs, the International Trade Commission estimates that $2.4 billion worth of IUU caught fish products entered the U.S. market in 2019 alone. In my written testimony, I have shared 10 next steps that can be implemented now to achieve a broader, more holistic vision to prevent IUU fish from entering our markets. To summarize just a few, let me say that we need a full functioning traceability system that is, one, standardized, expand the seafood import monitoring program, and work with other countries to develop a consistent global list of high-risk species. Streamlined, move to a full digitized traceability system that will support the use of risk-based analytics and reduce the burden on industry. And we have to get rid of the paper. In today's world, how many billion-dollar industries lack digitization and rely on paper-based records? Third, synchronize. The U.S. should widen its aperture to what is considered risky behavior. First, NOAA Fisheries should follow through on its work to amend the definition of IUU fishing to include forced labor in the seafood supply chain, and work across federal agencies to consider other risks linked to vessel histories, ownership information, and land and sea-based processing, transshipment, and ports. IUU fishing is a global problem that requires global solutions. The United States government has the opportunity and the responsibility to ensure more transparency and to chart a path forward that moves the seafood supply chain out of the shadows. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yozell. I'm going to note that there are submissions for the record, and these are from these individuals. Yes. From Judy Gearhart, Research Professor, American University Accountability Research Center. From Badri Jamali, the Horn of Africa Institute. From Stephanie Madsen, Executive Director at Sea Processing Association. And Michael Sinclair, former executive at Brookings. If there's no objection, their material will be entered into the record. Hearing none, so ordered. And now our chair has returned. Is everything fixed?
No, we'll have another vote in 15 or 20 minutes.
Thank you.
You know, Mr. Rabina, you mentioned auditors and you know, one of the things that I've been very concerned about for the longest of times, as a matter of fact, back in 2012, I actually chaired a hearing on this commission and pointed out that, you know, the ability of anybody to say anything of worth to an auditor when potentially there are people who will snitch on them, especially within the company, or even Chinese Communist Party security apparatus or types. Well, the audit hearing that we had made it clear that we focused on Apple and some of the other big companies, and that the auditors would go in, they'd talk to 6 people, they'd say, oh, they met them separately, you know, separately with recording devices going, and they said everything's just fine. And I'm wondering if that's been your experience. You know, our government, unfortunately, is too willing to accept that. They say, oh, they got a clean bill of health by auditing company X, Y, or Z. Many of them are foreign-based. They're not like Price Waterhouse. They're coming out of Europe and the UK. And I think it's a sham, frankly. You know, maybe there's some good people involved, but the process is a sham because you're going to get a Potemkin village almost every time. And I wonder what your thoughts might be on that. You mentioned, Mr. Stumberg, about NOAA. We're in a big fight with NOAA on issues relating to ocean wind. I'm leading the effort in my state because they and others, including BOEM, have been absolutely AWOL in terms of doing their due diligence about the impact of radars and the fish kill that we're seeing with whales. But reasonable men can disagree with that, but it's the radars is overwhelming. We will be blinded if these 3,400 size of the Chrysler Building ocean wind turbines go off the New Jersey, New York coast. And yet NOAA has been no help. I've been shocked and dismayed by it. And I'm wondering if you might want to speak to, how valid their work is on this. And then the issue that and Senator Merkley and I, in our letter yesterday to Secretary Mayorkas, bottom line, we believe the situation needs a robust and coordinated response across all federal levels, including DOD. What has been the response from USDA, DOD, which procures so much of this fish for our troops and for the commissaries? I have a commissary in my district, joint bases in my district. I've been to it many times, with others. I don't use it, but I go there when I do base tours. And there they are, around the rack, all this different fish products, which normally would be great. But if it's, as it is, sourced through human rights abuse, we got a problem. So I'm just wondering what their initial responses have been. Has there been a response? Because we're going to push really hard. I don't care who's in the White House. We want no complicity in human rights abuse. So whoever comes in next, might be the same, it might be Biden again. It just has to change. There's got to be an aggressiveness there that has been sorely lacking.
Thanks for the
Yes.
questions. On the issue of auditing, I would just sort of maybe pull up to altitude and take a big bird's eye view on it, and first start by saying it's important to think of seafood in the way that it's distinct from other products, and remember that there are these two distinct universes where seafood is coming from and processing through. And so when we think about the auditing system and you think about the two universes, the at sea and the on land, it's important to ask, okay, what do the audits look like at sea versus on land? And the at-sea audits are non-existent. So when it comes to labor. And that's a huge problem that's easily overlooked because it's the toughest problem to solve. Spot checks on ships and conditions on ships are really a big challenge. So that's one dichotomy I'd put forward. The second one is the question of what kinds of audits we're talking about. Are these marine audits or social audits? So marine audits are largely environmental in focus. They're focused on IUU concerns and these matters. And the private sector has more of an infrastructure for marine audits. They're flawed, deeply flawed, the marine audits, but they exist at least. How to check on the attempted traceability of where the fish is coming from, what gear is being used, what ships, et cetera. When it comes to social audits in the seafood space, there's far less infrastructure. And there are some firms that are doing these social audits, meaning checking on labor issues, but only on processing plants. So that's a second dichotomy I think is important to bear in mind. The next one is China. Audits in the rest of the world versus audits in China. That's another dichotomy to really not forget about. If you're going to operate in China, you got to play by their rules. And the U.S. Business Committee knows that, so do NGOs who are now working there. And those rules are pretty problematic. You can't ask certain questions, you can't say certain things. And so auditing firms and U.S. companies that are operating there know full well when they go in that they can't stay there unless they play by those rules. So there is a bit of a sham in having labor audits through private firms in China because there's this whispered sense that they're not really going to do what even weak auditing is supposed to do. And then the last layer I would go to is whether social audits, labor-focused audits on land in China are even looking for the right things and doing them in the right way. Are they even asking whether or looking for Xinjiang workers? What we found is the answer is no. They were not fluent on the issue of the problem of Xinjiang workers. And they were not looking in the right way for that issue. And then also, are they doing them in a credible way? In other words, are they calling ahead and saying, we're going to show up on Tuesday to check your plant? That's not a real audit because they know to clean things up because the auditor's coming on Tuesday. So these are the layers of questions I'd ask of auditing. And for the most part, the answers we got in our investigation were not hopeful ones.
You know, at that hearing in 2012, I just would point out that Thea Lee was one of our distinguished witnesses at that, speaking on behalf of the AFL-CIO. But we had Lee Kwong, and I just say this because I think it says volumes, who's the executive director of China Labor Watch, and he said, according to very conservative estimates, some 30,000 plants, over 100,000 audits are conducted for over 30,000 plants. The multinationals would then, more often than not, bribe the auditing companies by giving them like $3,000 or so to avoid making the investment, to make the improvements, and to really bring forward the information. So one, people are chilled from telling you what is actually going on. But secondly, auditors, and this hearing was in relation to things like what Apple was doing with its workforce in China. So, you know, big question flag when we hear about audits. In terms of the, you know, the response of DOD, for example, or any of the government agencies, I know your historic research is new, but what has been the react? Are they saying, let's meet with you, let's begin plotting out, you know, and Mr. Stumberg, I'm doing a rewrite of my original law. I'm the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, and we have a reauthorization that we're working on. It'll be marked up, we believe, at the next Foreign Affairs Committee meeting. That said, we're looking at some new language in a number of areas. I'd love to get your input as to how we could amend that or should amend that. So please, either now or in follow-up, we just need that from you, if we could.
That sounds like bait. I'll take it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, as implemented in the FAR, requires prevention plans to prevent the government from buying goods made with forced labor.
Right.
Good. It only applies, it only authorizes prevention plans for services performed overseas, not goods purchased by agencies, and explicitly not goods that are commercial off-the-shelf items, so-called COTS items, or otherwise known as canned fish. So, yes, there are prevention measures in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, but no, they don't cover any of the products we've talked about here today. And for the overseas services, what they have in mind is commissary services for military bases and embassies overseas, not importation of goods produced overseas or processed overseas. So there's a complete disconnect in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act as relates to the FAR, because a good thing, the FAR has imported those provisions in its rules for federal agencies to purchase by, unlike there's no connection in the Uyghur Act. So the agencies that are doing the procurement should follow the precedent set for trafficking victims by importing from the Uyghur Act some of its standards. But right now, what they would be importing is a flawed model that relates only to services, not products. Does that make sense?
It does. And
And
we
the
could follow
threshold
up
is
with you on
very
the
high,
text.
yeah.
Deeply appreciate it, because we're doing it right now.
Right.
So thank you. You know, finally, Mr. Sculla, in your testimony, you stated all North Korean workers in Chinese seafood plants who were detained during COVID-19 were recently repatriated. I understand that some of them had to stay longer than 3 years due to lockdown during the pandemic. Does that mean they will be reprimanded for staying longer in a foreign land and then contracted 3 years, even though it was out of their control?
Sir, so basically we're dealing with two categories of North Koreans, the ones who are there without government approval. China claims that they're illegal economic migrants. They're arrested, punished, and forcibly repatriated to North Korea, where they face a credible fear of persecution. Workers have normally been okay for as long as they follow the instructions of their three site supervisors, the State Security Department fellow, the site technical supervisor, and the party representative, the Korean Workers' Party representative. So they go back home, and for about 3 years, they're under the surveillance of their Gestapo, Stasi, basically the Ministry of State Security, and then they're okay. However, in this particular case, they overstayed their contracts. Most of them still moved around in groups. Their humanitarian situation was dire. There were no contracts. There was no money at their work sites. Few of them managed to moonlight if some companies were still open for business with the approval of the 3 site supervisors whom they had to bribe. We have had very credible reports from sources within the North Korean escapee community, who in turn have their sources inside China, that things were so bad that these workers had to work on Chinese farms. They barely had 1 meal a day. And it went as far as these workers go into the local markets to acquire vegetable clippings, the clippings that are thrown away, and making vegetable soup out of them. I have mentioned the issue of loan sharks. These workers do want, at the initial stage, positions overseas. The average monthly salary of a North Korean industrial worker is $3 a month. They can make as much as 70, or if they manage to moonlight, even up to 210. They have to pay a bribe in the amount of $2,000 to $3,000. They have to repay the loan sharks, interest accumulates. This is what happened under COVID, and they were all under tremendous pressure. We have had reports of about 30 suicides amongst these workers, most of them women. In terms of the repression they face when they go back home, based on what we know about how North Korea operates, yes, sir, they will be under much more pressure than their predecessors, who were simply out there in China until the contracts expired and then they came back home. In North Korea, it doesn't matter that you haven't done anything wrong. If there's a perceived offense of having worked at an unauthorized work site, having overstayed your contract regardless of the reason why, the likelihood that they will face some degree of punishment, if not harsh punishment, is quite high.
Ms. Yücel, a few years ago, I chaired a hearing on Malaysia and being red carded for their abuses with regards to their fishing. Can you explain the difference between the U.S. seafood import program and the red carding program of the EU?
Sure. So the EU system, as you say, is a carded system, and basically it is a government-to-government system in which literally there is catch verification that the seafood that is being caught is not IUU fish, and if it is, then a country will first receive a yellow card, and then if they don't improve their the work they do, then they get a red card, and when they receive a red card, all seafood from that country is no longer allowed to be imported. On the other hand, the U.S. system, the SIMP program, is it's the industry that is required to determine if seafood is the seafood caught is being IUU or not, and it is not government to government. Information is then passed through, and NOAA then determines, based on the information it receives from the brokers, whether or not the seafood is IUU fishing or is IUU fish or not.
Thank you so much, and I'm going to ask you, Director Urbina, thank you for your 4-year study, and in your testimony, you note that you studied some 751 ships, and you've also referred to how difficult that is. What does it mean to study a ship? Like, were 751 boats tracked as to what they were offloading and where they were offloading it, or were these conversations with 751 crews, or how did you go about this very difficult task?
Sure. Again, thinking in bifurcated fashion, at sea, on land. So 3 of the 4 years was really focused on the at-sea universe. And our hope was to look at the entire Chinese distant water fleet. That was too big to take on. So we then honed it down to look at the portion of the fleet that we thought was potentially most interesting and illustrative. So we honed in on the squid fleet for a bunch of reasons. The squid fleet in the distant water squid fleet is in the most interesting places around the world: North Korean waters, coast of West Africa, high seas Falkland Islands, high seas Galapagos. The goal then was to go to those 4 places and lay eyes directly on the vessels and try to talk our way onto the vessels to witness crew, witness conditions, check seafood traceability in their refrigeration, talk to officers and captains, et cetera. And that was successful in each of those places. We were able to get on vessels. When that didn't work, we interviewed crew through a very old school method of bottle communication. So we would write notes and put them in plastic bottles weighted down with rice and cigarettes and candy. And when the ship would try to leave, when they saw us coming, we would follow them, and I would throw bottles onto the back of the vessel, and the crew, usually the deckhands, the captain was looking forward, the deckhands were facing backwards. They would receive the bottle. Sometimes they wouldn't open it, read it. Other times they would. They'd take the message out. It was written in Bahasa, so Indonesian, because a lot of the crew are Indonesian, Chinese, and English. There would be a pen in there. Sometimes they would scribble responses to the questions back, phone numbers of family back home, pleas for help. They'd put it back in the bottle, throw it back over, we'd pick it up. So that was a labor-intensive process, but very effective in getting interactions with crew. So that was sort of the on-the-water method of reporting. The remote method of reporting was a deep dive on various forms of data, which would allow you to understand where have these ships been, by way of tracking them through satellite technology, et cetera. Are they engaged in sovereignty incursions, so illegal fishing in that form? Or is there a written record in any universe, be it foreign media or state reports or other databases, of dead bodies coming off of these ships, of infractions by these ships? So vacuum in all that you can about the vessels and build a database so that you can identify levels of concern for different vessels, and then connect the supply chain dots from those vessels to refrigeration, to port, to processing plant, to U.S. or European buyer. And so that's, the only way you have impact is if you can make it relevant to European and American consumers. And for that, you need the supply chain work. You can just talk about a bad thing happening on a vessel, but no one's going to care unless they realize they're tied. So that was the on-water investigation. The on-land investigation was a whole different, kettle of fish, if you will. And that took a lot of, and this was done by the investigative team at my organization, mining of media reports and cell phone footage by workers from within processing plants, OSI, open source intelligence, to see what you can lay eyes on. That Chinese TikTok, there's a lot of footage of workers chronicling their labor transfer from Xinjiang to Shandong. Here I am on the plane, here I'm arriving at my factory, here I am working, here I am seeing the ocean for the first time. So we mined all of that material to connect the dots to actually figure out how many workers were actually in these plants. And then also a lot of companies have newsletters, which are very candid. Mega parent companies of the seafood processing plants talk very openly about how appreciative they are of the Chinese government helping them fill their labor shortage by transferring workers. And so we mined that material as well, and a number of other materials to build a grid of knowledge about what are the plants that are using Uyghur workers.
It is truly a stunningly expansive project you undertook under incredibly difficult circumstances. And just as you were describing, throwing bottles onto the boats and hoping somebody will open the bottle, you apparently got a lot of bottles thrown back, giving firsthand accounts, and so thank you for elaborating on that. I am really kind of struck by just all of your testimony of how complex and difficult it is to tackle this particular this challenge. One piece that I hadn't anticipated was that U.S. flagged vessels fishing in their own waters ship their produce to China for processing. So immediately it's intermixed. U.S. produced food is intermixed with the Chinese flow. Is that an inevitable piece of the economics of processing because it's so labor intensive, or why is American seafood from U.S. vessels in American waters being shipped to China for processing?
I'll take that one on. Can you hear me okay? Inevitable is the word that I focused on in your question. I think the answer to the inevitable part of your question is no, but it depends. The challenge of solving that problem depends on the type of seafood. So if you look at the history of squid, very labor-intensive, costly, dirty work. And late 80s, early 90s was wholesale shipped to China for the cleaning, processing of it. There is not much infrastructure for processing of squid in the U.S. The challenge that the industry will face for finding alternate places to do that work is going to be tough. Pollock, different story. You know, there are, out of Alaska, at-sea processors who are doing a lot of the processing in U.S. waters, on U.S. vessels for U.S. consumers and avoiding the problem. Can they scale up? I don't know. But really an honest answer would have to look at the type of seafood and then look at how could we encourage processing alternatives that allow industry players to not rely on North Korean or Uyghur-worked factories in China.
I'll ask, thank you. And I would say, Professor Sundberg, you described Director Urbina's work as James Bond would be impressed. And I think that's certainly, the more you know about your project, the more that rings true. One of the challenges we've had with the UFLPA is that even if goods are detained, when they are released, they are sent to Canada. If they're banned from our market, they're sent to Canada or Europe. How much do we have to accentuate international cooperation to have any significant impact on this challenge?
In addition to that, 2 years ago, Congress asked,
Is your microphone turned on, sir?
it says talk.
Okay, okay.
2 years ago, Congress asked Department of State and Defense to look around the world and report back to Congress on the risk of forced labor in seafood. And Sally probably knows more about this than I do, but the report that came back to Congress was that 29 countries, including China, but 29 countries have a very high risk of forced labor in their seafood. And so the need for this kind of monitoring is profound. You're right. There are obvious markets all around the world. If they can't sell their seafood in the United States, they're going to go somewhere else. They are going to go somewhere else. Someone else will buy that seafood. So why bother, right? Well, from a moral point of view, why bother is easy. You know, the American taxpayers don't want to be trading on forced labor products just to save a few pennies on the dollar. Why bother in terms of the rule of law and a global economy that is working for working people in the United States as well as abroad? If American workers, including the processors in Alaska, have to compete with forced labor in China, they're not going to. How do you compete with slave labor?
So let me
Right?
let me reframe the question.
Right.
Because as a principal author of UFLPA, I certainly believe that we should be doing this. How do we get Canada and Europe to work in concert with the United States to help us tackle this challenge?
Well, I don't have a profound answer to that profound question, but I will observe this. Europe is ahead of this. The European Union has already approved a comprehensive sustainability disclosure mandate for all of their member governments, a directive that was approved and is now being implemented, approved last year, being implemented now, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So they're years ahead of us for that country, Europe-wide, industry-wide disclosure system, the kind of systematic approach that Sally was alluding to earlier, including very specific auditing protocols. And they're implementing it now as we speak. On the tail of that, both the European Parliament and the Commission have approved proposals for mandatory due diligence, which is, I guess, legalese for doing the kind of homework that Ian was talking about and the kind of homework that CPB has outlined for itself in its own work plan. It's just that when you read the details of the European approach to due diligence, It's pretty gauzy. It's chock full of legal jargon. It's hard to understand how it's really going to happen. But when you read the CPB program, you go, oh, this could actually work. So in some sense, the United States is a thought leader, but we're way behind Europe in terms of scaling this up and applying it not just to seafood, not just to food, but industry-wide, region-wide. So getting in sync with what the Europeans are doing, learning from the way they're scaling up this kind of corporate accountability, understanding that companies are going to have to comply with these EU directives, and they're going to be preoccupied with that for a decade or more while the Americans are futzing around with vessel by vessel withhold orders. You know, we're not on the same page, and the Europeans are really making us look like we're in the 20th century still. So that's a quickie answer to your question.
Thank you. Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Chair Merkley. And I think you could feel I was getting interested in this answer, because this is part of what I spend a lot of my time doing, is trying to think about how do we cooperate better with other countries, how do we cooperate better within the United States government, because we actually have some very powerful tools, and I think you all have mentioned several of them, and I don't think we're using them to the full extent that we need to or could do that. So I guess one quick thing with respect to Canada is that in our most recent USMCA trinational meeting, Mexico and Canada, under the USMCA, committed to also institute a forced labor import ban. And they don't know how to do it. So they are, we brought some of our Customs and Border Protection folks, and we are going through ongoing technical exchanges to help to see how far we can go in terms of sharing information that would make that more effective, because the Canadians and the Mexicans and even the Canadian and Mexican businesses said to us, we don't want to get all the forced labor import rejects that come from the United States. That's not good for our own competitive atmosphere. But and Professor Stumberg, I don't totally agree with you in terms of the European Union versus the United States. I think our tools are amazing. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the rebuttable presumption, which gets around some of the issues that Ian raised, that we don't have to prove or get access to China because we know China doesn't give access. They don't give access to auditors. But I think we're at the very beginning of learning how to implement those. And one of the things that I've also been doing in the G7 and the G20 is trying to figure out how we can take the very best of what the European Union is doing and what the United States has. A lot of other countries are very jealous of a forced labor import ban, in whole or in part, because if we were able to enforce the Tariff Act of 1930, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the North Korean sanctions, it would be massively powerful. We can't really do it all of a sudden. But I also think that the point that you raised, Professor Stumberg, about the integration of U.S. government procurement with the trade measures, the import ban and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, is exactly next. So I know that wasn't really a question, but the question is for each of you, and thank you so much for your testimony, for your work. One thing, if you could, with respect to enforcement, because I'm in the executive branch. I don't know how long it'll take Congress to enforce better and stronger laws. I know we need them, but I think that there's so much that can be done. What would be your number one ask of the U.S. government in terms of strengthening enforcement of existing laws? So if each of the witnesses wouldn't mind, I would love to hear from you.
I'm going to cheat and answer with multiple small pieces that add up to one. I think that when it comes to enforcement, as the point you made, there's a real problem within the U.S. government about agencies not actually working well with each other. And I know that sounds boring and very Washington-focused, but as I look at this over a decade, it's a huge problem. So you even look at things like trafficking getting introduced as a element within SIMP. The bigger issue is that the agency that oversees SIMP isn't built to be looking at trafficking issues and labor issues. ILAB is, and even state is, but the whole program of SIMP resides under an agency that's a bunch of folks that are really, really strong on fishery issues and marine issues, but not labor issues. But everyone is defensive about their jurisdiction, and therefore there's language in the rule, but not real actual implementation of it. That's got to be fixed, and it's by people in this room. Similarly, threshold issues, say in Customs and Border Patrol, at their own interpretation of WROs, and what is the threshold for a case that might be brought forward. This person was trafficked, here's the evidence. The burden is on NGOs and journalists to do all that work. That's a problem. And then it's handed to Customs and Border, and Customs and Border sometimes their lawyers will say, okay, but we want recent stuff, recent defined as within the last 2 years. These contracts, these people are at sea for 2 years. So your case is going to be automatically kicked out because your case of a trafficking human being is 3 or 4 years old. But the nature of the industry that that person's working in, they're going to be offshore for 2 years. So there are fundamental interpretive flaws and threshold issues in how these agencies are implementing the tools on the table, that unless someone really pushes and fixes those, the best law in the books isn't going to get what it's supposed to do.
First, a note about SIMP. As Sally explained, SIMP was built to cover environmentally illegal fishing. It was not built to cover human rights illegal fishing, nor does it cover any of the commercially valuable fish that the USDA and the Department of Defense purchases. If you just applied SIMP to what the U.S. government buys, that would be a big leap forward. And while you're at it, collect what relevant labor rights information you can. I'm not trying to pitch SIMP as the right place to have a human rights strategy, but it could be a very valuable tool if expanded as a coalition of 9 civil society organization recommended back in March. They did a really good report led by the World Wildlife Fund and 7 other groups. 2 other ideas. First of all, implement the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. What do I mean by that? It's now been 1.5 years since the work plan hit the pavement, right? Have some empathy for CPB. In response to their initial list of 20 known entities that have direct connections to Xinjiang province, they've been flooded with thousands of pieces of evidence about other entities. An entity could be anything from a vessel to U.S. foods. Thousands. So how do they process that? They have yet to come out with a rule or a guideline on how they're going to make decisions about how and when to add more entities to the list. But so far they've gone from 20 to 27, and that's it. So I have empathy for them considering the workload, but it's been 1.5 years, and at least they need a strategy for telling the rest of us, this is how we're going to sift through all this evidence. And you can say the same about the, I think whether they're up to now 5 high priority categories where they're focusing enforcement. I'd make the pitch that Ian is, giving them an invitation to add seafood next, simply based on his reporting alone. My God, this is such a valuable contribution, and he's done their work for them. And not only that, if I can say one more thing, when I read the CPB work plan published 1.5 years ago, I was like, this is amazing. I couldn't believe that this was from a U.S. government bureaucracy because it was so forward-looking. They were talking, and I assume they're working on this now, using artificial intelligence and the various computer databases, the very ones that Ian used, to intentionally sift through and pull out all the data that he's presented in his reporting. CPB implies that they want to be able to do the same damn thing with AI. Now, I don't know squat about AI, but I have a feeling that that's probably possible. So could Ian's work be a picture of what the future looks like at CPB? I hope so. Probably everything except, putting on your jumpsuit, hopping on a skiff, and chasing down people on the high seas. I don't expect CPB to do that. But we have to leave something for Ian and his grandchildren to do.
It's all about the jumpsuit. If I could say one last thing, but thank you so much for those answers. And I actually completely agree with what you both said here. And it's one of the things, iLab is in cooperation, talks with both CBP and with NOAA, because, as you say, we have the expertise. I have 165 staff now. We have tremendous technical expertise. And so we're doing some staff exchanges, we're doing some contracting, and we really do want, and we're in very deep conversation with NOAA about SIMP and ways that we think it could be strengthened and improved, and the definitions and so on. So I think that's really important. And with respect to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, you know, I sit on the FLETF, the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, and in fact, I co-chair the entity subcommittee. So I will tell you that we are trying as hard as we can. It's been very slow going. It's been frustrating, I think, to all of us. But, you know, trying to figure out, like, what can withstand legal challenge, what can be as robust as possible. But I share your frustration with the slowness of the process. But I will tell you that we are really trying to use those tools that Congress gave us as effectively as we can. And I apologize, I'm going to have to leave for catch a plane, but thank you again to all of you for your work.
If I could just hop in for a minute, please. I want to just note that you had asked what could be done, one or two things. I think number one thing that we've been waiting for quite some time is for NOAA to add labor and human rights abuses to the definition of IUU fishing. It's been they said they would a while ago, and they have backed off of that. In addition, I think it's really important. We recently interviewed several federal agencies and said, what do you need to do better at your job? Your agency, as well as others, all said sharing data and information. NOAA collects significant amount of information through its SIMP program, but it does not share it, as well as you and other agencies collect a lot of information that NOAA could use, but they haven't asked for it. So we really need to open that aperture and understand all that we can about risky flags, risky vessels, risky ports, and I could go on. And I also want to just note that, you know, there are a number of things that were in the NDAA and appropriations that have asked NOAA to try to harmonize the data and information more, and that has yet to occur. And then just finally, expanding the list of species covered. It's such a small list, yet pollock, salmon, squid, blue swimming crab, and haddock, all species we know have been the result of IUU fishing, are not on NOAA's list, and they must be expanded to those and others.
Thank you very much, Director Yozel, and thank you, Deputy Undersecretary Lee. This is why it's so valuable to have this commission have members of both parties from the House and Senate, but to have members of the executive branch. And I think much of the recommendations and ideas that are discussed here, having you here to hear them directly from your role inside the administration, hugely helpful. I hope we have given you sufficient time to catch your plane, but really appreciate that you're here in person.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to raise some questions provided by others, starting with one from Congresswoman Wexton, who would like to have been here. And her question is for you, Mr. Urbina. And she asks, currently most Americans focus on where their fish is caught. For example, is it caught in Alaska or is it caught in Norway? Not about where they are processed, as in China or Russia Far East, and by whom. How do we make the complex supply chain more transparent so importers in the U.S. seafood industry understand that they are not violating the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act?
Yeah, I think seafood, again, is distinct from, you know, tomatoes or cotton or computer chips in that it traverses these two universes. And so one big thing that has to happen intellectually in the public space is we need to not be talking about seafood as a marine issue, but be talking about seafood as a product that crosses land as well. And so I think, you know, that's one big step. So environmental groups, Oceana, you know, for example, or Greenpeace or Sea Shepherd or whatever, need to be really working more closely with Human Rights Watch and lawmakers who are focused on land issues more than they are now. Number two, I think the infrastructure that exists for the private sector to monitor and trace its supply chain also has to evolve a lot. And hopefully this will be a poke in that direction, in that they can no longer, I think, simply put forward that they're MSC certified or that they've been, sort of accredited as a good steward by a private entity, and therefore they're sort of part of the ocean conservation team. That's not enough anymore. I think there has to be much more involvement by seafood companies in the on-land labor issues. And then lastly, I think Sally, really said it best. The definitional change in IUU to incorporate sea slavery or human rights issues is one big step. And then building on, as Bob and Sally have both said, SIMP, a flawed tool, but the one that's probably the most developed on the table. Building on SIMP, expanding it, redefining it, getting more agencies involved in it, is at least what I hear from experts is probably the best step for trying to get the supply chain of this product more under control.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Chair Smith would like a little bit more of information regarding how has China reacted to the reporting about forced labor in their seafood industry?
I'll answer that. So with a wall of silence, I mean, if you think of three big players that you would expect to respond to this reporting, one would be the market players, so seafood companies in Europe and the US. The second would be government players, meaning this government. And the third would be China. The history of the last 2 years of engaging with market players, and we put all of our interactions with all 300 companies up on our website, has been largely a wall of silence. Most of the big companies refuse to engage. A couple of exceptions engaged. Lunds is one example, where these are companies that didn't agree, didn't like what we were telling them, but were willing to converse and knew they were on record the whole time and pushed back at times, but were very open and trying to figure out how to fix these things. But the vast majority of market players did not. And I think that's a big problem because those who don't engage end up getting very little journalistic light on them because there's just this wall of silence from them. And those who do engage end up getting a lot more spotlight on them, even though they took the high road. In terms of the Chinese government, there have been a couple of comments coming out of the Overseas Fisheries Agency Association, essentially calling the story and the reporting fabricated. But there's something interesting in that response, which is, and this is something I think the public in the West needs to be mindful of, they elide definitions. So they are quick to point out, under our own laws, nothing illegal is happening here. This is not forced labor. These people are paid a wage. They're given vocational training and happy to have these jobs. That is, and it's all true, and it's all coming from the Chinese government, but it's irrelevant. And I think, luckily, the U.S. media and companies are understanding that that's irrelevant because of the category that is child labor, or prison labor, or North Korean labor, or Uyghur labor. That's point one. There have been market reactions since the reporting. So big companies have already begun severing ties to major factories in China. And so that's having clear financial repercussions in China. But that's about what we've seen.
Thank you. As we're talking about this, I was thinking about a whole different piece of this forced labor, which is the west coast of Africa. And my daughter worked with children who were basically sold into the fishing industry, and the ships are like anchored under the old slave castles. So it's like a very dramatic ancient slavery, new slavery. But all of that seafood is domestic consumption, so it doesn't enter into the supply chains in the way that we're talking about here. And I've read reports of other slave labor in other parts of the Pacific, in which again it's mostly for domestic, but this is an area where the supply chains affecting the U.S., we have perhaps more leverage if we can solve the complexity and bring all the forces to bear. I did want to go back to just one piece of this, which was the purchasing by the U.S. government. And I believe that was noted, and I'm not sure which of you raised this, but the three exceptions. That was your testimony, Mr. Stumberg, that the U.S. government, the exceptions include domestic supply is unavailable, domestic prices are too high, or it's intended for resale. So you're saying that essentially the U.S. government will purchase non-American seafood if it's in one of those three exceptions, and that this ties into the possibility of purchasing seafood from China that has been produced essentially by slave labor. Do I have that correct?
You do. If I
Okay.
could illustrate one of those exceptions. If it's not available, for example, first of all, what does that mean? It's not available as a U.S. caught seafood, or that it's simply not available in terms of processing in the United States. So the rule itself is vague. It's open on that point, but then it goes on to say that, well, let me just leave it at that because it gets very technical at that point. In terms of the price reasonableness, it's a 20% range, right? So comparing U.S. processing to any low-wage country, where do you get into a 20% range? I don't empirically understand or know what that looks like, but when you add the prospect of forced labor in that low-wage country, you can imagine how it gets to the point where it's not inevitable, but until someone says, no, you can't use forced labor, the price advantage may well be such that unwittingly the U.S. standard for what's a reasonable price incentivizes processors to go elsewhere in order to compete with the U.S. government.
That third category, that it's intended for resale, why would the U.S. government be purchasing these supplies, non-American supplies, for resale?
To help stock commissaries and to provide the raw goods for other contractors who are running cafeterias for U.S. government facilities, that kind of thing. Right. And I mention it only because it's very explicit in the regulation. So they've thought about it.
And finally, I want to turn to you, Mr. Scarlatoe, for bringing the North Korean aspect to bear. And you noted the enormous stress in which individuals may be excited about being able to leave North Korea for higher wages, but the North Korean government takes 90% of the wages, and the wages perhaps aren't paid until they return to North Korea, what might be many years, and that meanwhile the interest is accumulating on the money they borrowed to pay the bribe to get on that trip to begin with. And that the stress of this combined factor has produced significant evidence of suicides, primarily women, you mentioned. Why primarily women?
In both categories, that of North Koreans who cross the border without government approval, and in some industries where North Koreans are dispatched officially by the government, depending on the industry, women represent a higher proportion than men. In the case of refugees, about 80%. In the case of the workers, if we're talking, and again, it's industry-based, restaurant workers, textile workers, they're mostly women. At the seafood processing plants, there are particular tasks that are assigned to women, peeling the seafood, measuring the seafood, and of course, they have to spend time within those terrible working conditions in the refrigerated cold rooms, a very harsh environment. They have to experience the pungent smell. These are jobs that North Korean workers take up. Chinese workers would not take up these jobs because the working conditions are so terrible. It is very likely that women are more affected by both the physical and the psychological toll that these working conditions take on them. Some of them happen to be married women, to have left families behind, and the stress of not only having to live under these working conditions, but also to be unable to repay those loans and interest takes a very heavy toll on them. There is no proper health care provided, and of course there is no mental health care provided, none whatsoever to these North Korean
These
workers.
suicides are happening while on foreign labor or after return to North Korea?
We had reports that these suicides happened in China while they were still unable to return home.
And the loans have to be repaid after one returns to North Korea?
They continue paying them once they're dispatched to China, in this case as seafood processing workers. Of course, the $70 a month that they receive from the North Korean regime, not in dollars, but in North Korean currency when they return, is not enough to cover the debt and the interest, and thus they have to moonlight and do odd jobs, of course, with the approval of their site supervisors. Unless they do that, this would be perceived as great wrongdoing and they would be punished.
Touched on a lot of different pieces of a complex puzzle. Thank you each for bringing your perspectives and knowledge and experience to bear. Do we have closing comments that need to be read into the record?
I think we can leave if there are supplemental materials that, by close of business Friday, people can submit.
If there's any supplemental materials or questions from members of the commission, please submit them by end of day on Friday. And if we do have additional questions to send to you all, please respond as promptly as possible so we can get those into the record. Again, thank you very much for your testimony and your work on very significant human right challenge, one that this commission is determined to highlight and to develop as much as possible legislative strategies to increase our ability to improve those conditions.